Development Scrutiny panel. First thing, I'm just going to go around and do some introductions. So my name is Councillor Alex Worrell. I'm the chair of this panel. If I could just go around to my left.
Hi, good afternoon. I am Khaled Mueed, Labour Councillor for Knoll Park.
Hi, I'm Dawn Barnes, Liberal Democrat Councillor for Forties Green.
Hi, I'm Tammy, Labour Councillor for St Anne's.
Councillor John Bevan, Labour Councillor Northumberland Park.
I'm Holly Harrison-Mullane, Labour Councillor for St Anne's.
Thanks, so just round to the right.
My name is Philip Slaughter. I am the Scrutiny Support Officer for this panel.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jada Rahman, Operational Director for Housing Service and Building Safety.
Councillor Sarah Williams, Cabinet Member for Housing Services, Private Renters and Planning.
Good evening, everyone. I'm David Joyce, Director of Placemaking and Housing.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lynn Seller. I'm the Manager of the Private Sector Housing Team in Community Safety and Regulatory Services.
Thank you. So first item of this meeting is filming at meetings. Can I just refer everybody present to the information published on the first page of the agenda? Second item is apologies for absence. We've received apologies from Councillor Blake.
Councillor Gordon also sent her apologies.
Okay, thank you. Third item, urgent business. There are no items of urgent business. Fourth item is declarations of interest. Do any members have any declarations of interest they need to make? No, thank you. Fifth item, deputations, petitions, presentations, questions. We haven't received any.
That's correct, Chair. There are no deputations, questions or petitions for this meeting.
Next, we have minutes from the last meeting. Is everybody happy to approve the minutes from the last meeting as an accurate record? Does anyone have any questions they want to raise on those minutes? Are we happy to approve? Thank you. Okay, now on to membership and terms of reference. I'll hand over to Philip to introduce this item.
Thanks, Chair. So this is a procedural report that we have at the first meeting of every year. So what you have in your pack at agenda item 7 on page 7 is the membership in terms of reference report. The main committee, Overview and Scrutiny Committee, formally set up the panels at its first meeting back on the 8th of June, and along with that set up the terms of reference for each of the panels and the terms of reference. So within your pack at Appendix A, you have the terms of reference for scrutiny. You have the scrutiny protocol at Appendix B. Appendix C is the non-voting member protocol, and Appendix D sets out the policy area and remits for each of the scrutiny panels. So the report here is asking you to note these. At 5.3 of the report, you have the membership for each of the 4 scrutiny panels set out there, including this one at the bottom. I guess I would just draw your attention to Appendix D as probably the most relevant document here. And when you later discuss the work plan, this sets out what areas the panel has responsibility for. So just bear that in mind as you're thinking about what you might like to look at going forward. I won't say anything else other than that. And as I say, the report's just for noting. So thank you.
Do members have any questions on the report? Councillor Hymas?
I just noted that there's the opportunity to appoint external advisors to scrutiny panels as outlined in the Constitution. Is this something that the panel would consider going forward in order to particularly get more resident representation into this panel?
So there is facility within the regulations that govern scrutiny for co-optees to be put on the scrutiny bodies. There are statutory co-optees that are on the main committee. They're the sort of education representatives. In terms of the panel, some of the other panels do have co-optees on them. This one doesn't at present, but there is scope to do so. I think the future of housing scrutiny is being developed in terms of sort of housing services having come back in-house, and there is probably a conversation to be had as to how best to incorporate resident engagement in that process, and whether that's somebody sitting on this panel or something else.
And just to note, that's something I'm keen to see and have raised with officers, and we'll pick those discussions up in our planning for future sessions as well. Does anyone have any other questions? No, so we're all happy to note the report. Great, thank you. Let's move on to the next item. So first, we're going to have an update on working with the social housing regulator. That is, Jahed's going to introduce that. Sarah, did you want to say any political introduction? Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to introduce Jahed. Obviously has the PowerPoint that it'll speak to. Just to say that since the Pennington's report and then the self-referral in the months that have ensued since, obviously it's very clear we've got a very steep mountain to climb. But I think in conversation this evening and through the questioning, we can tease out that a lot of work is already been achieved. A lot of milestones have already been achieved in such a short space of time, which I think is very positive direction of travel, whilst also remembering we've still got a long way to go. So I'll let Jahed introduce the PowerPoint.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. If we can bring the slide up. So the committee asked for an update on how we're progressing on the work that we've got since our referral to the social housing regulator, and where they then deemed Haringey in breach of the home standard. So I suppose the first slide, highlights some key dates, and it's useful just for context. So on the 1st of June, Homes for Haringey transferred back into Haringey Council, and the slide will talk about in detail when the transfer took place, what our compliance position was in terms of what we inherited. Subsequently, the council commissioned an external audit by Pennington's to undertake a health check, and that audit really highlighted some of our key gaps within our compliance areas. And then in January, Pennington shared a copy of their report, and subsequently, based on that report, the council made the decision to self-refer ourselves to the regulator for social housing. And then in March, the regulator issued a judgment of a breach of the home standard. And then I'll briefly talk about where we are in terms of our current position in terms of performance and how we compare in comparison to the last 6 months and in comparison to when we brought the AMWA back in-house. So the next slide really talks about at the point of insourcing, what was our compliance. So as a landlord, we've got 6 big areas of compliance that we're responsible for, making sure that we're on top of those particular pieces of compliance areas. So at the point of insourcing Homes for Haringey, our compliance position in June was that we had 80 overdue fire risk assessments. We had just over 9,000 overdue domestic electrical certificates that hadn't been completed, and just over 7,000 overdue fire risk actions, of which 4,000 or just over 4,000 were high risk actions. I think given the position that we inherited as a council, the council were concerned particularly regarding the overdue electrical inspection and fire risk actions. So the council sought external assistance from Pennington Choices, who are external auditors, to undertake a health check of the council's approach in meeting our statutory health and safety requirements. And that piece of work started in December. And Pennington looked at our 6 key areas of compliance, and then reconfirmed the 2 that we had concerns around compliance, which was electric and fire risk actions that were overdue. And further reiterated, in their view, they also believe it's a potential breach of the home standard. The next slide, if we go forward again, one more. This, gives us a snapshot of where our position was in December in comparison to what we inherited or what transferred over from the AMO in June. So although at that point we still had an overdue number of fire risk assessments, there was an improvement of 1, so nothing too significant. The electrical inspection reports, again, we had just over 8,000 that were overdue. So some improvements were made of about 1,000. And then the fire risk actions continued to decline in terms of the numbers that were accumulating as backlog. At the point when we self-referred to the regulator, our fire risk assessment had improved. So at that point, we had 26 overdue fire risk assessments. We still had a significant amount of overdue electrical inspection reports, just over 7,000, but again, an improvement of 1,000 in comparison to December. And then we had just over 4,000 high risk actions. I suppose the key information that members would want to know is what is our performance at the moment. So at the moment, we've got 0 backlog on our fire risk assessment. So that's a significant improvement to what the AMO inherited in June, our position in December, and our position in January. And that fire risk assessment is being maintained. So we were conscious that we don't continue to build a backlog, and we've added additional capacity both internally and externally to make sure we're on top of those fire risk assessments, and we continue to have 0 that are overdue. One of the sort of biggest inroads we've made was around the number of electrical inspection reports that were overdue. So when the AMO came over, it was just over 9,000. As of May, that's just over 3,000. So what you can see is a really significant improvement around the electrical inspection reports that we need to undertake in domestic properties. I think more importantly, when we self-referred, there was just over 4,000 properties that didn't have a valid electrical safety inspection that was over 10 years. That's now reduced down to 440. And predominantly, why we've got those 440 is due to access issues. So we'd ordinarily write to the resident, booking an appointment to do the electrical inspection. And if they don't give us access, we'll write to them twice, 3 times, and subsequently we'll then have to take legal action to do the necessary checks. So in terms of the work we've now got going forward, myself and David meet regularly with the regulators to confirm what our performance is at the moment, agree the short-term plan and the longer-term plan. One of the points the regulators picked up when we did the self-referral was the high percentage of non-decent stock that we have. So Haringey at the time had just over 30% stock that were non-decent, and the regulator's view was that was significantly high, and therefore as part of the breach of the home standard also asked us to review our strategy around reducing the level of non-decent stock we have. So we are currently working with the regulator, having a monthly meeting where they're reviewing our performance around all 6 areas of compliance.
So I'm just adjusting the volume.
Sure.
I just missed the last bit that you said. I just couldn't quite hear. Sorry,
Yeah.
If you could just repeat, that would be really helpful.
So one of the other points, in addition to the 6 big key areas of compliance the regulators have been reviewing, is the percentage of non-decent stock we have in Haringey, which was reported around just over 30%. And one of the focuses and discussions we've been having with the regulator is understanding how we reduce the level of non-decent stock we have. So in addition to the monthly meeting where they review our performance on compliance, what we can see and what they can see is a direction of travel which is really positive. One of the things that we've agreed to do going forward, and it's not mandatory for organisations to do, it's completely voluntary, is to do a voluntary undertaking. So a voluntary undertaking will be going to Cabinet in July, where with the regulators we agree clear milestones on these are our key areas of challenges, these are our recovery plan, these are the timelines that we're working to, and the view is that Cabinet will approve it, and that will be a undertaking that both ourselves and the regulators work towards in delivering, and then subsequently the notice will be removed. Happy to take any questions on this.
Thank you for the report. Just to let everybody know, I'm going to aim to let this run until about 7:15. Do any of the panel have any questions to kick off with? Councillor Bevan?
Well, I've got some questions. They're slightly off of the title of this report, but they are mentioned in this report, so I will actually say them. On page 12 of this supplementary paper, it refers to use of spreadsheets as some undertaking with the regulator. And then on page 14, on page 13, it refers to a new supply chain. This issue of spreadsheets has been about for for years. I think we need a date when these spreadsheets are going to be finished with, because my understanding is there is a new computer system installed during COVID that should be able to work so that spreadsheets are abolished and all these targets are on the new computer system. You can check, they come up when they're due to be looked at. So I'm really concerned that this spreadsheet issue seems to be coming up all the time. So I think we need a date when all the staff know how to make use of the new computer system and have all this data online and electronic and God knows what else. So that's my first point. And the second point, it refers in this report to engagement with the regulator, voluntary undertaking, new supply chain. Now, I'm aware there's huge issues with the supply chain, and I'm really concerned that the project that we had, the £800 or £900 million project to work with partners on a 4 or 5 year partnership with contractors, has stalled. It was delayed when I was involved with housing. It's now delayed again, I understand, and that project is absolutely crucial to get a proper supply chain that we can rely on. So can we have an update on what's happened to that?
Yeah, sure. And I think if I take your first question on spreadsheets, that is a valid question. Part of the challenge Haringey have historically and currently actually is the way we're recording information on spreadsheets. The very nature of the way compliance works, it's often a number that's constantly changing. And the more you work on spreadsheets, the more you load on spreadsheets, there's the potential error of human error. So one of the things that we've agreed with the regulator, and it will be part of our undertaking, is a clear timetable on when we'll be moving away from spreadsheets over to a compliance system. In terms of timeline, at the moment, the compliance system is with procurement. It's due to go out for tendering next month. There's a view that once we've done the tendering, we'll do an award with a supplier with a view by April next year, we'll have a fully implemented compliance system, and we move the team away from using spreadsheets to a fully functional compliance system. In terms of the other IT system that you do mention, that would be NEC. And NEC is a great system for housing management, but it's not a great system for compliance. So there will be an interface between our existing housing management system with our compliance system. But this piece of work that we're procuring is purely focused on moving the team away from spreadsheets to a fully working, functional compliance system.
Thank you.
And the 800, 900 million pound procurement framework process, where has that got to? Because my understanding that is stalled big time.
So I think there's two separate issues. One is our partnering agreement around the wider plan investment across the borough, and the specific issue here is where we've got over 3,000 high-risk actions, what proportion do we need to package up? And then once we've packaged it up, source specialist contractors to go and do this piece of work. So we've identified from the, just over 3,000 high-risk actions, there's about 1,600 pieces of work we'll package up as one contract that will go to a dedicated fire risk specialist contractor who would then be undertaking the work.
I think you've slightly misunderstood my question. It wasn't specifically related to these actions. It was related to the refurbishment of our estates, capital building works investment type thing. That's the contract that I'm talking about.
Did David want to come in to answer that?
Yeah, I think just to sort of respond, the partnering contract, which is about basically getting long-term partners over a 10-year period to do the major estate refurbishment programs, is still very much something that we're progressing. I think one of the areas where we've had a greater churn of and turnover of staffing at a senior level has been asset management. So one of the things, so there have been some delays. One of the things that Jahed is doing is recruiting a senior team to kind of lead that work moving forward. So that's just one of the inevitable consequences when you bring an Almo in-house, that there are some areas where you lose some capacity, but we are very much getting on with it. In the background, we've been finalising a number of the packages and going through some of the questions around the detail of how we'll procure those partners, and we've been continuing the market engagement. So we haven't just been kind of not progressing it at all, but I would accept it's been a bit slower than we would have liked, but it's still absolutely a priority. And the other thing to say is that we are still progressing individual procurements on particular packages of work pending that partnering work coming in. So, we're also not waiting for the big contracts to be let and not getting on with it in the meantime, just to provide that reassurance.
Councillor Moeed.
Yeah, I just wanted to understand the referral a little bit better. If I could ask, so there are 6 different areas that are highlighted. Was it our decision to refer these things, or was it the regulator wanted to know? The reason I ask is obviously all of these things are very important, but as councillors, our experience on the front line when we do our surgeries, the main concern isn't that the fire risk assessment hasn't been done or that gas safety hasn't been done. It's the state of disrepair, because some properties are in such a bad state or repairs have not been done for a very long time. That seems to be overwhelmingly the main concern. And I would have expected that to have featured here as one of the areas that we would refer if we are doing a referral to the regulator. I haven't, so I just wanted to understand that a bit better, first of all. Secondly, obviously the housing services, Homes for Haringey, we've just brought it in-house. To what extent can we put this down to how the Almo was managing our housing services, and looking forward, how confident can we be that now that it's going to be internally managed in-house by us, that let's say in 12 months' time, the picture won't look like this when we refer to the regulator? Thank you.
Yep.
I think you raised some really interesting points there. just to say, my my focus with the team has been that we have to concentrate on compliance. Compliance is, if there's a lot of plates in the air, things that have to be fixed, like you point out, repairs, which this report isn't focused on. We have to ensure we're compliant with all of the regulations, so that we can be sure that our residents are safe in their homes. That has to be the top priority. So on if you want to take one piece of information away from this, is that's got to happen all the time. And of course, as time goes on, and you continue to do all the checks, there will always be a level of non-compliance, because things will become non-compliant. So it's a continuous focus on ensuring we have the highest level of compliance within all of those 6 areas all the time. But I'll let Jahed come in on the more specific points you raise.
Thank you, Councillor. I think one of the biggest priority for me, the council, is to make sure the residents that live in our homes are safe, and the buildings that we have are maintained safe. And, you know, compliance does give us a level of internal checks and processes to make sure we're maintaining our blocks based on the statutory requirements. You asked the question, to what extent did we make the decision to self-refer? It was a council decision that we actively made that decision to self-refer to the regulator. You know, other councils may have had tenants or internal staff that whistleblowed to the regulator. In our case, we looked at what the data was telling us around our gaps within compliance. We wanted to make sure that we genuinely create a high quality service, but in order to do that, we do need to be quite transparent and open with our residents around where some of our performance gaps are. So in the spirit of co-production with the regulator, we self-referred. You asked the question, to what extent was there any mismanagement within Homes for Haringey? Whilst I wasn't here at the time, and it's not something that I think I particularly want to focus on, there are 3 root causes of why we got to where we were. One was around the governance. The second was around data quality and a lack of suitable management plans in place. And the third was around program management and reporting. I think going forward, what we have done is looked at what was the root cause, why did we fail, and going forward, how can we strengthen those areas? And that's a piece of work that we're working with the regulator to make sure we don't find ourselves in a similar position going forward. And those are all 3 areas that we're investing time, energy to make sure we get right going forward.
Thank you. Councillor Hymas and then Councillor Barnes. Oh, yeah, you want to come back on that question?
Yeah, we'll just trade quickly. Thank you, Chair. Just going back to the 3 areas that you highlighted, Jahed, as being problematic, governance being one, which is where we come in really as the scrutiny panel. So Homes for Haringey was accountable to the council. This is before your time, so we won't focus on that, and it clearly wasn't being honest, or something wasn't happening, so it wasn't fully accountable. How can that be different with the new reporting system? And what steps can we take to ensure that it is more accountable, and that we as a panel have a better oversight of what is happening? And your reporting system presumably will help with this once it comes in, but in the interim, what can we do? Because that's about a year away.
So I think there's 2 points that is slightly different going forward. One is, one of the things that we've committed to going forward is to do an annual self-assessment to Cabinet on how we're performing against those big 6 areas of compliance. That's something that wasn't done before. The second point is where we've got an internal recovery plan and we're progressing against key milestones on the improvement plan, and we're closing down a number of actions, we'll then be seeking external assurance that what we're saying internally has been done. So not only are we saying it's been done, there will be an external check to confirm if it's been done or not. The third point around spreadsheets is I think both us and the regulators accept up until we move to an automated system, there will always be a position of potential error because of the way the teams are working. And that risk will always be there as long as we're using spreadsheets. So our immediate priority, and that's something that we've already now put into practice, is to start the procurement process, have a clear timetable, share that with internal colleagues as well as the regulator on when we hope to have a fully fledged implemented system. I would like to say I'd like the system sooner, but I think if we look at the realistic timetable of procurement, doing the awards, transferring all of the existing data to a system, training, we have taken all of the activities on board. So we think at the earliest it will be April next year.
Yeah.
Can I just add one point to what Jahid said, which is obviously that we have established the Housing Improvement Board, which has cross-party membership, as you will know, chaired by the Chief Executive, attended by a Cabinet Member, where we, on a monthly basis, are reporting our progress against the Housing Improvement Plan more widely, but including a specific focus on the housing compliance position, and that is backed up by the fact that Jahid is receiving a weekly update from his team, and also chairs a compliance board where he very closely scrutinises all of this, and it gets reported through to Housing Improvement Board. No doubt we'll have further reports here to this scrutiny, and obviously Jahid's already mentioned the annual assurance statement to Cabinet as well.
Thank you. Councillor Hymas, and then I'm going to come in. Did anyone else? Yeah, okay, and then Councillor Harrison-Millane.
Yeah, I guess my question comes back to this governance point, and is maybe thinking a little bit about resident engagement as well, which I know is a big part of the Housing Improvement Plan. And I guess it's worth just remembering that with Grenfell, obviously, fire risk was something that was highlighted for a long time before by the resident association and was frankly ignored by the council. So I think it's important to note that. But looking at the new kind of structure for resident engagement, it's a lot, right? And from what I could see, that we've got a resident scrutiny panel, a new residents forum, a continuous improvement group, a customer core group, a resident housing advisory group. We've got a complaints advisory group, a resident voice board, a housing improvement resident group, task and finish, and our RA network. My question is, we're doing so much time recruiting more and more residents, and yet when I do my work, I go and speak to my residents association, and they could list, all the fire risks that they have in the estates. They could go and tell me they have electrical problems, and yet that infrastructure is rarely developed on estates. It's actually quite exceptional to have people who are driving that forward. So I guess my question is, how can we put more investment into that? And also, how can we make sure that our residents are having that locality-based engagement rather than simply the more wider resident voice engagement, which seems to be at the top level, which obviously comes with all sorts of issues around representation, for example.
Who would like to come in? Councillor Williams?
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point, because we all want all the tenants and leaseholders to be engaged all the time, but it's very difficult through those boards sometimes. But I think we're really canvassing hard to try and get those boards populated with the representative number of people. But also, additionally to that, I think something that's really important is visibility of the housing service, so people know who to go to, and Jahid's been doing quite a lot of work around that maybe he'd want to talk about.
Yeah, so I think in terms of visibility, one of the comments I certainly got, and I think David got, was residents not knowing who the local housing team are. So one of the first things, and it was fairly quick to do, was us to write to all of the residents, letting them know who the housing officer is. The second bit we want to do around visibility is, sometimes it's not always about physically being there, but communicating our presence. So we've now started to update some of our notice boards that have key information on who the housing officer is, how often are our cleaning team on the estate, when are the grounds being maintained. So providing more local-based information locally, so residents can be more informed of who their housing team is. I think longer term, we do want our housing management team to be working with wards where there are active resident associations in developing ward-specific improvement programs, which the housing officer has the local budget to be able to deliver. That sits outside of the wider planned investment program. In terms of the sort of overall resident engagement structure, we are now recruiting to that resident group. They all have some oversight on what we're doing around compliance, but they'll also have oversight across a number of improvement that we're doing across housing. So compliance is probably one of the biggest priorities, but within the housing improvement plan, it lists 13 different areas on all of the activities that we intend to do to try and improve the overall service to residents, not necessarily just specific to compliance.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask a few questions now. Can I ask you to just say a little bit more about what the nature of our work with the regulator actually looks like? So are they providing, you mentioned regular meetings, are they providing expertise? Is it resource as well as it support with reporting? That was my first question. My second question, we've obviously made real progress with fire risk assessments and electrical inspection reports. So my simple question is sort of how have we done that? How have we got so many ticked off? And what can we learn to try and replicate with other services that are in desperate need of improvement, such as repairs? And also, because it's come up, could you clarify where the Housing Improvement Board sits in terms of governance and what interaction our panel should have with that? I think a commitment was given at a previous meeting that they might report into this panel. And yeah, is that still going to be possible? Thank you.
So if I just take your first question on fire risk assessments, we had, at the point of insourcing around 80 overdue, and that's now down to 0. The very nature of the way fire risk assessments are being done is we've got an internal team that were doing it, and what we've now done is complemented that with an external team. So there was certainly a capacity issue in the number of assessments that needed to be done, and that needed to be matched with making sure the team have enough resources to do it. So one of the things that we've done is we've procured external help to be able to keep on top of the fire risk assessments. On the electrical, part probably the good news story is we've got a really good, supply chain that we're working with in carrying out the electrical inspection certificates. So when we self-referred, and that team were already working on a program, when we self-referred and the regulator highlighted just over 4,000 properties where it didn't have a valid electrical certificate over 10 years, we asked our supply chain to focus on those 4,000 with a view to close as many as we can by May, and then bring the remaining domestic properties that had or that didn't have a valid electrical safety certificate within a 5-year period to get those done by December. So part of that was just reprioritising the way that team work based on where the immediate need is. In terms of the question around how can we replicate that within repairs, within the housing improvement plan, and we did this across all service areas in housing, looked at what are the specific challenges, and certainly for repairs there are challenges. We're investing an additional £2.7 million in our repair service to both increase internal capacity, add additional supply chain, but also have a really data-driven performance culture. And I think part of the challenge historically is where we've had system implementation, that data may not have been readily available. So we're working with internal teams to really interrogate what the data is telling us, using that to manage staff and teams.
I was going to come in on the Housing Improvement Board. So it's not my board, it's the Chief Exec's board, but I think that is, we should probably report to this panel, but it's not in my gift to make a commitment to that now, but that's something I will discuss with the Chief Exec and see if that can happen.
I'm going to take Councillor Harrison-Mullane and then Councillor Hymas, and then we might have to wrap this section up. Thank you.
Thanks. So looking at the timeline of the various figures we've been given, it looks like a mixed picture for the first 6 months after insourcing, and then some very sharp improvements between December 2022 and January 2023. So I was wondering if we could get a more detailed picture of what exactly was happening in January 2023 that pushed those improvements. And then secondly, referring to page 12 about how do we get to the position we're in now, one of the points mentioned is management structure and governance. I think it would be useful for the understanding of this committee if we could get detailed organograms or reports, or however it needs to be presented, of what the management structure and governance structure were that led to the problems and what they are now that's being proposed as the solution. I understand you might still be working with the regulator on that, but it would be useful to have updates as that progress happens.
So I think, what I'm quite keen to discuss is the management structure we've got in place now. So we've got a Housing Improvement Board chaired by the Chief Executive that meets 6 weekly to talk about the overall housing improvement plan across housing. For building safety and compliance, there's a board that I chair 3 weekly, and then there's also a capital board that I also chair 3 weekly, and that feeds into our overall strategy in reducing the non-decent stock that we have. And then, as David had already mentioned, there are teams that report to me weekly on some key areas of performance that I'm quite keen to make sure we're on top of and we stay on top of, and we become aware of any challenges before it becomes an issue. And also the monthly meetings we've now got in place with the regulator, and I think you asked this question, they look at our figures. The last meeting, for example, where we were not 100% on gas, they did ask why. And again, when we looked into and we provided an explanation, our responsibility is to make sure that we're doing the annual gas safety certificate. Where we can't get access to those properties, we're taking immediate and quick legal remedies. So as long as we can demonstrate that we've attempted to do compliance, we've taken all reasonable steps to do it, the regulator will be satisfied. And ultimately, it would be our position to then go to the court and, if required, take an injunction, do a forced entry, and then do that, that statutory check that we're required to do.
Yeah, come in.
Can I just come in on one point of your question, which was about the kind of period between insourcing and January? I think another really important change is that we did make an appointment of an operational director to make sure that our housing services have more sort of dedicated leadership and oversight to really kind of get on top of the issues and the problems that we've got across the service. I think that was a key move. But also, I think, going back to the point that this was a self-referral and we ourselves commissioned an external independent assessment, and that was partly because the data that was being reported did not necessarily raise with the organisation the concerns that do in fact exist. And we did have a previous audit report that went to the Homes for Haringey Board, which suggested that there was some unreliability of the data and really kind of flagged that it was important that we did an independent assessment, which is what we did in commissioning the Pennington's work. And that obviously came back and set out that there were a range of issues around the data reliability, that we've talked about tonight, and provided a roadmap for how we move forward on a much stronger footing and how we can get to a place where we can rely on the information that's being provided. And so I suppose what I'm saying is that I think for the first 6 months, what we were sort of presiding over was unreliable data. And it wasn't really until we did the penitence report that we had a really accurate picture of what the position was that we inherited, what the position was at that point, and how we can now turn it around. And we got that roadmap, and then obviously Jahed's appointment and some other senior appointments that he's made has meant that we're sort of more accurately getting on top of it, but actually really shifting the underlying position by moving away from reliance on spreadsheets and the sorts of things that we talked about earlier. But I just felt it was important to revisit some of that journey in response to your question.
Councillor Hymas.
Yeah, just a quick question on clarification actually about the electrical inspection reports. Do we have data on how many of those reports, which when done, required additional works in order to make them compliant? Was it a case of just going in and getting the report done and there didn't need to be any major changes, or was it often that there needed to be significant changes in the property?
So the very nature of the way we do the work is if a property requires work, we wouldn't have a valid EICR, we'd do the work and then issue the EICR certificate. So where we go in and the property requires work, we'd do the work and then we'd issue the certificate. I think the challenge for us has been, not necessarily the work or the scope of work, where we've got properties with no accesses and continuing to get no accesses. We'll have to go through at some point the legal process to then do a forced entry to carry out the works.
But you don't know, you can't say approximately. So are all of the outstanding actions requiring work, or are some of them probably not?
So as of now, so from the 4,000 that didn't have a valid electrical certificate over 10 years, at the point of self-referral, and now it's 440. Those 440 are due to no access, not because we can't do the work. We'd only issue a certificate once the works are done, we're satisfied, and that's when the certificate's issued. So we wouldn't issue, or our contractors wouldn't issue a certificate if there's an outstanding repair that needs to be done.
Thanks. We're going to move on to the next item now. Thank you, everybody. So the next item is an update on the council's work to address damp and mould. I don't know if Councillor Williams wanted to say anything on this as well.
Very briefly.
Thank you.
Obviously, there's been a renewed focus on damp and mould after the shocking reports on Rochdale, and that report has rightly made landlords take a good look in the mirror and provide detailed evaluation of all the homes. In Haringey, our response is as outlined in the two documents you have before you. So it's really just to take questions on those reports now.
Thanks. Did David and Lynn want to pull out any key points from those reports, or do you just want to go straight into questions? Oh, yeah, Jahed.
Thank you, Chair. So we've submitted a report for members just to provide an update on some of the work we've been doing since the tragic case of our Ishak. So when the particular case happened in Rochdale, one of the things the regulator did was they wrote to all chief executives of social landlords, asking them to confirm how many cases of damp and mould they have within the stock and how many category 1 cases and category 2 cases that they have. So one of the things that we've done in Haringey was, whilst we may be aware of the properties that residents have notified us, we're more worried about the properties that we may not be aware. So one of the first things that we did was we tried to develop a predictive tool. So what we did was we analysed the range of data across housing to identify where we may have potentially category 1 cases. So we looked at our stock condition surveys that we're doing, where we looked at properties where there's been a repairs history over the last 2 years that may indicate there may be a category 1 damper mould. We also looked at all of our open and closed disrepair cases, and then looked at where we may have blocks with structural issues, and then looked at the EPC ratings of particular blocks to understand, based on all of the data that we've got, are we likely to have unreported category 1 damper mould cases. So what our predictive tool then determined was, we, based on our initial data analysis, was we felt, and this was at some point in January, we potentially got 64 possible cases of category 1 damper mould, and category 1 is the most severe type of damper mould that you can have that has an immediate threat to life. Once we've developed the predictive tool, the next step was for us to really go into these properties to ascertain, are they category 1 cases or not. So we subsequently collected the data, used all of the insight and intelligence we have within the organisation, and then attended to these properties to determine whether they were category 1 cases or not. From the 64 that we identified, we were able to assess 63. The one we had access issues, and then we determined that, that there were 10 category 1 cases from that potential 64, and then we subsequently identified an additional 6 that were reported. In terms of our sort of damper mould offer, it's something that most organisations have been working in a very fluid way to understand what the data is telling them, and then subsequently what is the damper mould offer that they can offer their residents. So certainly for us, we did a damper mould policy that went to Cabinet in April that got approved. So in the most serious cases for damper mould, where we go in and identify it as a category 1 property, we'll do an immediate damper mould wash, but more importantly, we'll offer a temporary decant. So, and that decant is only temporarily once we go in and do the works, because our immediate priority is to move the family away from that immediate hazard whilst we can go in and do the work. Once we've done the work, the family will then be expected to move back into the property. And then 3 months after, within our damp or mould policy, we've outlined that we'll go in and check if the damp or mould has returned. And then category 2 cases are moderate hazards. And on those particular cases, we wouldn't offer a temporary decant, but we would schedule in the works to be done, and then again go in and visit the work if the damp or mould has returned. I think part of the challenge we've had, and this isn't just in Haringey, this is a national picture. Most landlords have struggled with, what the data is telling them, and then there are wider issues around fuel poverty, overcrowding, and particular issues around certain component replacement. A number of cases that I've reviewed are around overcrowding. So as a landlord, there's not much we can do around overcrowding. We've got a waiting list of just over 12,000 families, and some of the issues of damp and mould is where you've got a family of 6 living in a 1-bedroom, and whilst we can go in and do temporarily move them out, do the works, that the damp, the reality is it's likely to return because you've got so many people living in a really small property. So overcrowding is definitely an issue, and also the level of non-decent stock we have. It does, sometimes it's not necessarily a damp and mould wash. There are extensive work that we would need to go in and carry out. And I think in order to try and simplify the way damp and mould is reported to us, we've got a dedicated damp and mould hotline. So when a resident wants to report damp and mould, it doesn't go through the corporate call centre, it goes directly to our repairs team. They would book in, they would assess based on the information they've got, whereby it may be a category 1 or category 2, we would then immediately book in a surveyor to go in and assess it. and then based on the outcome of the surveyor's report, that would then determine if it's a Cat 1 or Cat 2. And if it is a Cat 1, we'll offer a temporary decant. I think part of the initial challenge at the beginning was not having enough suitable homes to provide a temporary decant. So initially, when this when we had loads of referrals, we were in some instances putting families in hotels. Now we've got a pool of temporary decant properties. So when we do identify temporary decants, we try and avoid putting families in hotels and put families in one of our temporary decant properties.
Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, if I could come to Lynn now, and then if the panel have questions about both private and council damp and mould, we can just do it all together. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So I won't go over because actually we've got quite a lot of consistency between how we are dealing with damp and mould in the private rented sector to what Jared has covered. I think the difference really for the private rented sector is that we don't have access, obviously, to our tenants. So the focus really through the Department for Levelling Up for the private rented sector was using the powers that are available to local authorities within the Housing Act to identify and continuously review the private sector housing stock in their borough. And that was covered through the report in the use of Part 1, which allows us to do assessments and then take enforcement action if it meets the guidance. And then the other two areas were Part 2 of the Housing Act, which is our property licensing schemes for houses and multiple occupation, and Part 3, which allows local authorities again to introduce selective property licensing. So that's for privately rented dwellings that are not houses and multiple occupation. We have been able, because we've got those two types of discretionary licensing in Haringey, to have undertaken, similarly to, as Jared suggested, predictive modelling to try and work out where the private rented sector properties are in Haringey, and then based on stock age and size and other information, intelligence and data, where those particular properties might be in our private rented sector that will have category 1 hazards. Now, that predictive modelling at the time was done before the damp and mould situation came out. So we don't have any knowledge of what those category 1 hazards are in the private rented sector. All we know is that the predictive modelling suggested there was 12,000 privately rented homes in Haringey with a category 1 hazard. In the PRS, it's more likely that category 1 hazards are around excess cold rather than damp and mould. It's all very scientific, but essentially, a home with excess cold is likely at some point to generate damp and mould if it's not looked after properly. So we weren't able to give DLUC specific damp and mould assessments, but they were quite happy with the fact that as part of having the licensing schemes that we have done a stock review, and that we're obviously proactively targeting the private rented sector in Haringey. And the other thing just to add is that we've always had a reactive service in terms of private sector housing tenants being able to complain to the council, and damp and mould is obviously one of the big ones when we head into the winter months. So we do have data on the number of complaints that we receive year on year for damp and mould. And similarly to housing services, we are looking at moving to a new IT system, which will allow us to capture that information hopefully a lot better moving forward, which is a system that hopefully tenants can fill in themselves, so they're able to give a lot more detail about what's happening in their home, whereas at the moment they have to ring the call centre, and the call centre staff, through questioning, glean what information they can, and then they assess what category to put the complaint in. So sometimes it might not be labelled as damp and mould, but when we get there, it is a damp and mould complaint. So we've got similar issues in terms of reporting in that sense. So yeah, thanks.
David, did you want to come in, or shall I move to questions?
I suppose just can I just maybe come back on one point, and Councillor Hymas talked about it earlier in terms of listening to tenants and the culture. That was definitely a factor in the Rochdale case, and I think one of the things that we have been doing as well is, although we don't think we've got a problem in terms of not believing tenants when they report damp and mould to us, because I think it's quite well understood amongst our staff group that we do have damp and mould issues across our housing stock. We have nonetheless used the learning from the Rochdale case to sort of re-emphasise to staff that it is really important that we listen to the kind of lived experience that residents are reporting to us. We go and check it out, we assess it, you know, in the way that Jahed described, and that we do offer things like decamp where we need to. So I think it's really important learning from that, and we do recognise some of it is a kind of culture change issue with the staff as well, and a training issue, and there's quite a lot that we've put in place, and the training hasn't just been, as I think Jahed said, for our sort of repair staff, it's also been a kind of wider awareness training for housing management teams or other teams that may be going in. We also did a different version of the training for children's and adult staff who will be going into home settings and may be able to, you know, they certainly wouldn't do the formal assessment of damp and mould, but they may be able to spot some of the early signs and then refer it across.
Thank you. I didn't catch everyone that wanted to ask last time, so okay. I'll just go along in a line. Councillor Moeed.
Thank you. I'll ask my first question on damp and mould in social housing, then I've got a separate question on the private rented accommodation. The report here in section 6 identifies 3 challenges, and Jahed, you've also covered them in some detail. But what the report doesn't do, and I'm afraid also you didn't do, is to tell us what's going to be done to address these challenges. So if I take them in turn, first of all, fuel poverty. Haringey has, it's more than the London average. So the residents who are experiencing fuel poverty, they're not able to heat their home, they face a double whammy. So they can't heat their home and they have damp and mold. So there's going to be, so question is, what can we do, what is being done to help those residents? Overcrowding is another one. Again, the report mentions the problem when you have, and certainly this is what we also see as councillors. The 2 of the most common problems that residents come to us, disrepair and overcrowded accommodation. So again, you know, if Jahed gave the example, a 1-bedroom flat with 6 people living in them, that's not uncommon. We've had people come to us and talk to us that they're living in those conditions. And again, obviously, they probably have damp and mold as well, which is not going to improve anytime soon because they continue to live in overcrowded conditions. What is going to be done? What can be done? And finally, if you could also clarify, you said that the report says there's 30% of our housing stock are decent home standard. Does that mean that the remaining 70% aren't? And it talks about...
I think it's a mistype. It's 30% aren't decent. But
Haringey means decent homes are standard. Yeah. Okay, all right. It's the other way around. Okay, so that's obviously reassuring. So 70% meet the decent home standard, and within those, there are several that have single pane glasses, and they're not able to have double glazing, and they have this problem. So look, just want to understand what can be done, what is being done, what thinking is going into this to help those people.
Thank you for the question, Councillor. So when we have a case of severe damp and mould, one of the things that we do offer is dehumidifiers, and often tenants say to us the running cost of running a dehumidifier is fairly expensive. So one of the things we have done is we've picked up the cost for that. The second point around the sort of wider poverty within Haringey, we have a financial inclusion team within housing, and one of the things we can get better is signposting some of our most vulnerable residents to that team. They can certainly get external grants for those families, or seek additional funding or different tariffs from energy suppliers where you've got households in the most financial need. So I recognise that's an area where we probably haven't been promoting as much as we can do. In terms of overcrowding, we are currently looking at or reviewing our lettings policy, because at the moment you've got families in Band A who are the most priority based on medical. It doesn't include necessarily, families who are overcrowding don't necessarily get a higher priority, and we're just not building enough homes to meet the demand for housing in Haringey. I think there is a case where we go in, we find a family in a severely overcrowded situation. We think it may be a category 1. We can go in and do the temporary repair, but the damper mold is likely to reoccur. So having a more policy-wide discussion around what the long-term plans can be. So those are internal discussions we're having at the moment, but nothing's been formalised. But I do understand my colleagues in lettings are looking to review the lettings policy and the banding and the criteria. In terms of the 30% of our stock that is non-decent, so for this financial year, one of our targets is to bring around 1,000 properties into decency. So that reduces the 30% to around 28%. There is I would love to try and bring all of our properties within decency within 2 years, but there is a funding issue there. So at the moment, our earliest projection is based on the funding that we have to bring all of our stock within decency. It will be a period of over 5 years that we can do that within. So unfortunately, there isn't a quick fix to try and address decency. There are funding pressures internally within the HRA. So we are reviewing, what are the short-term plans and the longer-term plans. But based on current forecast, it will take about 5 years to bring our level of non-decency to decency levels.
Follow up. This may be a question for the panel there. We have obviously homes that are overcrowded. We may also have homes that are under-occupied because perhaps children have grown up and they've left home, and when it was originally allocated, it was a family of 4, but perhaps only the parents live there. Is there any scope to switch people around, or is that too controversial?
No, it's not controversial at all. I think it's an incredibly important part of our overall strategy. And in fact, with the new homes that we're building in the Council House building programme, we have something called the Neighbourhood Moves policy in place. And one of the groups that would be prioritised in that scenario would be under occupiers, would be prioritised for the new sort of 1-bed or 2-bed properties, depending on their need. And to be moved into those. And obviously the massive benefit of that is they free up a family house in the background. And we have seen, in fact, when you look at some of our new developments like Rosa Luxembourg, there are some really good examples of where exactly that's happened. People have moved into a 1-bed flat. We've made it possible for the Neighbourhood Moves policy for that to happen. And then we've got a family home behind. So it's a really important part of the overall strategy.
But is this a voluntary scheme, or is it's once you've identified, a home that's under-occupied that they have to move?
It's absolutely a voluntary scheme, but obviously the incentive that we can provide is, some of our new build stock are amongst our very best homes, and so there has been quite a bit of demand coming from that. But the best part of it for us is that we are also facilitating a family unit as part of it.
Just to add to that, is the business case for building single beds is a lot better than for building larger properties, but then it has we're trying to build, it's not really my portfolio, it's Ruth, build more family-sized homes, but there's the added thing that with the single properties you might actually free up some more family-sized homes. So when you look at the overall strategy, we're hoping it's going to work. But I think nobody's really mentioning the elephant in the room, that there is a crisis in housing in this entire country. in every form of housing, whether it's social housing or private rented sector. And what we can do to address the issues here in Haringey are limited while we're still in this landscape that nobody in this room wants us to be in for much longer, if you know what I mean. Yeah.
I have a question on the private rented accommodation. It won't be long. Just wanted to ask, the hotline for damp and mould, is that also available to private tenants? And just secondly, we've got selective licensing, so it's not all the wards, only some of the wards are covered. But under the licensing, is it possible to refuse license if they're not compliant, if it is, damp and mould?
So we don't have the same hotline as the council customer services, but we do have a dedicated private sector extension as part of customer services. So those calls, anybody ringing to do with private sector housing related complaints, go specifically through to a trained group of people on the customer services front end side of things. And in answer to your second question, we've got borough-wide licensing for houses and multiple occupation. Selective licensing is in the east of the borough because we wanted that for property improvements where we've got most need, and the west, unfortunately, didn't meet the deprivation criteria that we were using to identify need. We can't refuse a licence. So the whole point of licensing is that we want people to license because we want to know where they are, we want to know who owns them, and we want to know what the condition of the property is. The idea of licensing is to gain compliance by getting landlords to do the works that are required or to manage their property effectively. What we can do is not allow somebody to be a licence holder if we don't think they're a fit and proper person to be managing or in control of that property, but it's very legislatively bound fit and proper person test. So the idea really, in an ideal world, is that we create an environment where landlords improve and they learn and they want good quality housing themselves, and that licensing allows us really that proactive road in because they have to come forward. In the past, we've relied generally on tenants complaining, and then we have that fear factor of tenants not wanting to complain because they don't want to be in a position where they're being evicted because they're seen as troublesome tenants. So licensing protects tenants from eviction, and it also means that we can come into a property without having to reveal to a landlord that anybody has complained. So it sort of gives us that added advantage, which is one of the reasons why the Secretary of State wants local authorities to use those discretionary powers that's available to them, because it does kind of give us an advantage in that sense.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Councillor Barnes.
Thank you, Councillor, for asking many of my questions, but I do have some more. I wanted a couple of clarifications. One comes out of that set of questions for Jahed about bringing 1,000 homes into the decent standard in the next year, and that would bring us down to 28% being non-decent, and it would take 5 years to bring all stock to being decent. How is it only 5 years when it's only possible to get 2% to decent in the next year? It just sounds very ambitious. I don't want it not to be ambitious. I just want to know that it's realistic. And then I wanted a bit more clarity, Lynn, on, and I think I know the answer, but I just wanted to be sure. The only properties then that you can approach in private rental sector are those in the east of the boroughs. So, for example, and I don't know that there is any mould, and I don't suspect there is, but the property next door to me has a private landlord. I'm in the west of the borough, so you wouldn't have any access in. You do. Great. Thank you. Thank you for those clarifications. So then I wanted to ask, how many calls have been made to the damp and mould hotline since it went live, and then have subsequently been assessed and fixed as a result of those calls? And I also wanted to ask about housing associations, because I have a lot of casework from housing associations, not just around damp and mould, but around damp and mould as well as everything else, and where they fall into this.
Who wants to come in first?
Can I just take the point about housing associations? I think it's important to note that all housing associations received the same letters that we did as local authorities, and they had to do their own responses to the department and to the regulator around their own performance and be accountable for them. We did also, as Haringey, have a meeting in this very room actually with all of the housing associations who operate in Haringey to have a discussion about, you know, our shared experiences around damp and mould, what we're doing and what we're doing collectively as a sector. Ultimately, if a tenant has got an issue with their housing association that the housing association is not addressing, they could then come over to Lynn. It's not something that I think we ever really want to see, though, because the housing association sector should be dealing with its tenants and should be accountable to them. And obviously people can complain to the housing ombudsman in the way that they could do with the council as well if we haven't satisfactorily resolved a complaint. But nonetheless, Lynn's team is a bit of a backstop for that.
It is. Yeah, so we will get involved if, well, we would get involved if there was an imminent risk to a tenant, but generally we will ask them to make sure that they've gone through the first stage of the housing association's complaints process. And then obviously if nothing's happened as part of that, we will then pick the case up. And we tend to, in the initial stages, do act as an advocacy service between ourselves and the housing association. There's a lot of housing associations now who just won't speak to us, which is becoming really annoying. And, you know, so again, yeah, we're sort of back to square one. We're trying to support the tenant, but getting information through those sort of means. So yeah, we will pick up those sort of rare ones where off the back of a referral from us, the housing association hasn't done anything. But to be fair, if we do kind of highlight that it's come to the attention of our services and there could be potential enforcement action, they do tend to react, which is a shame because it shouldn't be that way. But that is the stick, unfortunately, that does seem to work.
Has that covered all your points?
Just the hotline question.
So we've received 519 calls on the damp and mould hotline.
Sorry, and then it was how many of those have been assessed and fixed as a result?
I don't have the full breakdown to hand, but I can come back to you on that.
Yeah, that would be good to get that, please. Thank you. I'm going to come to Councillor Bevan, then Councillor Harrison-Mullane, then Councillor Hymas.
Yeah, 16 Category 1 cases is quite a surprise to me because it's incredibly low considering the size of the stock that we've got. That's just a comment. But can you tell me how would I recognise the difference between a Category 1 damp issue and the lower category, I'm assuming it's 2 issue? How would I as a person, if I went somewhere, know whether it was 1 or
Yeah, you'd have to go on a training course, Councillor Bevan. It is incredibly difficult. So the officers are trained and it is a science-based risk assessment that looks at the hazard, the likelihood of harm to the occupant and the risk of that harm happening. And there's a scoring system. So the officers go and do their assessment, they take down all the details, they come back and we have a computer system that we put in all of the scoring along with guidance that helps us make the decisions. And then it then provides an overall score and those scores are banded. So anything from an A to a C banding is a Category 1 hazard, and anything from D, E and F is a Category 2, and then it continues, E, F and G is Category 3. And in most situations, if it's a Category 1, you have to take enforcement action, or housing services have to take it. If it's Category 2, we can issue the landlord with a remedial awareness notice that says that you've got a low-level Category 2 hazard at your property, and if you don't do something about it, it may become a Category 1, but we generally don't take enforcement action, which is why in the letter to private sector housing service providers, the government asked us specifically to look at those bandings of Category 2 hazards and where we could push landlords to do more improvement works, because the science, it's very difficult to get a Category 1 damp and mould hazard. So they have to be very bad. And the couple that we've had, we've just prohibited the use of the property. And those tenants have been picked up by housing services. So they tend to be situations where there's the structural integrity of the property is such that it would take either a huge amount of money or a huge amount of time to fix the issues that are causing damp and mould in the property. So we're now waiting, obviously, from the coroner's inquest results for the review of the science behind the HH, the Housing Health and Safety Risk Assessment that we use to assess damp and mould, because hopefully that will start to shift now the outcomes for the assessment, because now we know that actually damp and mould is more hazardous to somebody's health than the science previously was predicting when it was done back in the 1990s. So yeah, and as I said before, the two tend to come hand in hand. So if in certain circumstances, the excess cold in a property is what's likely to have caused the damp and mould. They don't have adequate heating, or they have electrical storage heaters which is not adequately heating a room, or there's no mechanical ventilation sometimes, and that's the cause. Or there's a leak in a roof, and actually fixing the leak will inevitably remedy the damp that's been caused and then the mould. So when we do the assessment, the idea is to find what the cause of the damp and mould is, and then an effective remedy is what comes out of the assessment process. But it's taken in conjunction with a wider assessment of a property. So it could be that we pick up other things when we do the assessment.
Councillor Barnsley, come back on that point.
Sorry, Chair, thank you for that. Just quickly to fully understand that. So category 1 is structural. So
no, it's not necessarily
structural.
It's just that in damp and mould situations, if it's not something that can be easily remedied, and it's likely that then the damp and mould so severe because there potentially is structural issues with the property.
What I think I wanted to get to was, I've visited at least 2 properties where they literally cannot use their kitchen cupboards, they cannot use their wardrobes. Yeah. So that wouldn't be a category 1. That's just an inconvenience that you have to stack your pans on the shelf instead of put them in the cupboard.
So that's what I'm saying. So that, in conjunction with any other defects that we find at the property, would then probably move that into a category 1 hazard. But if you were going in and looking at something that was condensation related, that would be a category 2 hazard on its own. And what we would say is, well, you might need to open your windows, you might need to move your wardrobe away from the wall, or what, but anything, normally in conjunction with other hazards identified at the property, it would make it a category 1. Yeah.
I just, relatedly to this, I was going to ask, there was some reference to, in the very severest category 1 cases, you might consider a permanent decant. So
temporary decant.
Oh, so only temporary, even in the most severe cases. Okay.
Given alternative accommodation via the landlord, and if not, they're picked up, unfortunately, by a homelessness team. But we don't have very many cases, where that happens. Usually they'll either be moved out while the works are done and moved back in again. But there have been occasions where we've had to say the property's not suitable for the family to continue to live there.
Thank you. So my question was going to be, because obviously category 1 is already the sort of most at-risk category. So how are you deciding what is the most severe category 1 case, and what would an example of that be?
So I think Lynn covered the sort of SRS training that our surveyors undertake, and one of the things that we've done in housing is actually trying to roll that training out to not just repair colleagues but housing management colleagues as well. I think one of the challenges we've had is that the training itself is actually quite complex. It's quite hard. Even surveyors have sort of struggled with it. But the criteria that we use is the definition that they've provided. So we would base it on the judgment from our surveyors based on physical inspection, and the criteria that they use based on the training they've received and the criteria around it. And if they deem it being a category 1, then we then implement what our policy position is, which is a temporary decant, but it's only a temporary decant for social housing residents, not a permanent move.
Okay, I think it's just that the wording of this made it sound like there was some variation in how category 1s might be treated within category 1, but I think we're getting a bit pedantic here anyway. So, Councillor Harrison-Mullane.
Thank you. I had a few questions, but I actually just wanted to ask a follow-up question about that last point. On page 51 of our pack, we've got some bullet points summarising the decamp policy, and particularly there's one bullet point that I'll just read from that says all decisions will be referred to a decants panel, and then further down the page, the panel can only offer permanent decants in limited circumstance. So what are those limited circumstances? Is that bullet point a mistake? What's going on there? And then I've got some further questions after.
So I think that relates to more management transfer rather than in relation to damp and mould. So we've got a decamp policy as well as a damp and mould policy. So there may be cases where, based on the household information, there's a panel that convene with housing management and lettings that they may then present for that family to be rehoused permanently.
Okay, cool. Thank you for the clarification. That makes sense. So the other questions I had, firstly, was, as we know, in a lot of homes, damp and mould are seasonal problems. And I think it's great the progress that's been made in reviewing all those cases that were flagged by the predictive software, but it would be helpful to know whether those cases were looked at in winter when the problems would be more apparent, and whether there are plans to recheck things in winter. I'm asking that specifically because there's one resident who emails me all the time about this, and who I know has had an inspection in summer because of the long wait between when she first reported the problem and when the inspections took place. So it would also be, I think it's great that the new policy includes details about how long that wait should be, but it would be helpful for us to have reporting figures on how often we're meeting that as laid out in the policy, and how long people are waiting, particularly if people are reporting problems in winter and then getting assessments in summer. I'll go through all the questions quickly if that's okay. My next one was about our residents who are in temporary accommodation. I know that that's obviously a group of tenants that we are in closer contact with compared to your average private sector tenant, and that we have additional responsibilities for. And also from my casework experience, it's an area where there are significant problems with damp and mould. So it'd be helpful to know what we're doing to try and help our residents who live in temporary accommodation. And then my last question, I wanted to follow up on some of what you were saying, Lynn, about the science and re-looking at how we do these assessments. People might be aware that there's some residents who have paid privately for blood tests showing levels of various chemicals, which are controversial and are more often used in America than here, but that link certain markers to damp and mould in their homes. And I know of one resident in particular who has been very concerned by the results of her blood test and has submitted these to housing quite a few times and sort of been dismissed. So it'd be helpful to know what the position is about that.
Who's going to come in first? Jahed.
I think in terms of sort of wider reporting around damp and mould, I think it's useful to stress again that team are again using spreadsheets, and you're fairly limited to building in sort of reminders on checks on when things need to then be followed up on. So again, one of the priorities for that team, and we've already started having this discussion internally, is to get developers in. So we've got a range of CRM systems that are being used across the council. What we need in that team is a very specific damp and mould CRM system, so that clearly tracks based on the policy. When we've done the visit, automatically alerts teams to do follow-up work, and then enables us to identify issues across different themes. So the type of data and intelligence we'd like at the moment is done manually. So we are working to move that team to a system that is bespoke for managing damp and mould cases.
Can I just make a clarifying point on that then? So although we've introduced the policy about assessments within 2 weeks from now, it will be over a year before we're able to routinely tell whether we're actually meeting that 2-week goal then.
No. So I think the policy covers a range of things from the point it's referred to us to when we book an appointment, to book a surveyor out, when we offer a temporary decant or not, when we go and do the works, once we've done the works, and then doing a follow-up visit within 3 months. So at the moment, that's manually generated. Ideally, we'd want that to be in a fairly slick system that we can accurately report against.
The other questions?
Yeah, sorry. The next one was about temporary accommodation.
I don't know. Temporary accommodation?
Oh, right.
That was TA,
So you mean where we've got tenants who are in temporary accommodation? Yeah, so I mean, don't forget that residents in temporary accommodation are in a variety of forms of accommodation. So obviously we've got some who might be in Haringey Community Benefit Society properties, which are actually within our council buildings, and we would treat in terms of repairs and damp and mould in the same way as our own stock. We have people in the private rented sector. We unfortunately at the moment have people in bed and breakfast. So there would be a range of different approaches depending on what type of accommodation there is. There is an added level of complexity as well in the way it works is that there are certain things which the landlord is responsible for repairing under the lease, and certain things which we take on responsibility for when we take on these leases for private sector rented accommodation. So there's a bit of an extra level of complexity there. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, there can be instances when there's a dispute between the landlord and the council about who's responsible, but we try and prioritise getting the work done obviously in these circumstances so that the residents in a safe accommodation, and we recover the cost later if we believe it's the landlord's sort of responsibility.
We've also got out of borough placements of people in TA in Haringey as well. So there's an added complexity for those that are privately rented sector TA placements. But we do pick up TA placements the same as we would another privately rented sector property. So they wouldn't be treated any differently but by us. Just the added advantage of having an immediate contact if they're Haringey TA placements. But yeah, they get dealt with the same if they're a privately rented sector TA placement. And also we do have something called Testing the Standards, which is a inspection programme using the HHSRS, where we've got a London-wide pan-London assessment programme where the EHOs are going in and assessing temporary accommodation. So damp and mould will be part of that as well. So.
There was also the question around the blood tests and the way that the science deals with that when residents are presenting, which felt like difficult a question for me, I must admit. So I'm hoping then you might be aware of this, or Jahed, but have we had any cases like that?
No, so I'm not aware of those, but it may be that they've gone to our public health team, because I do know that, so we are working closely with public health on the damp and mould side of things, and we're trying to get ready for the new winter season and looking at what new types of comms we can get out and information that we can get out, and using third-party voluntary sector organisations. And as David said, we're also doing training for primary care frontline officers. And I know that they are looking at a study at the moment about the impacts of living in damp and properties that are prone to damp and mould, but I think there's a funding issue, and that's with the university, UCL, I think. So I'm not aware of it, but I do know that there is with the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health and others looking at this, obviously because of the outcome of the coroner's report, how we look at changing the assessment programme for identifying the hazard around and damp and mould. And I think it's going to take a while, to be fair, for that to come through.
What I have seen, and what we've all seen through this process, is cases where there is medical evidence to support a vulnerability that suggests we need to ascribe a higher level of priority than we otherwise would. So particularly for some of the category 2 cases where you've got perhaps children with severe respiratory issues, and we've definitely had cases where, you know, we've had medical certification to you know, demonstrate what the parent is saying to us about that, and obviously it then feeds into the assessment around likelihood of the risk leading to an issue. So there are definitely cases like that. Just it's just the blood test thing that I haven't seen so far.
Yeah. We wouldn't act on that either. So.
Thanks, Councillor Hymas.
Yeah, just to follow up that point, have we considered doing any kind of cross-cutting work looking at health outcomes in our young people? For example, like numbers of days taken off school, and compared that with the data analysis that we have done around the damp and mold prevalence? Because my experience from the casework as well is that, you know, of course, some kids living in houses have pre-existing vulnerabilities, but often those vulnerabilities are massively boosted by the damp and mold that they have in their flats.
That's an interesting point you raise. There's a board we have called the People's Board, and what that's doing is bringing together adults, children's, housing, my bit of housing, not the building, housing and public health. So that's actually a really important meeting, and we've just had one meeting so far where it was a special deep dive into damp and mould, because we know that health outcomes for children, there are lots of reasons that housing has a huge impact on outcomes, their outcomes, and that board is going to meet regularly, and I think having public health in the room it will be helpful to that as well. But there isn't any of that. That is the place that the cross-cutting work, I think, can start to happen. That hasn't happened so much in the past.
I think some of the priority work around cross-cutting work has been with children's services around damp and mould. So we routinely have cases where we think it is a Cat 1 case, and would want to temporarily move the family out because they've got young children and do the work, or at least offer the option to do the work whilst on situ. There are families that have been reluctant to temporarily move out, but would want a permanent bigger accommodation. And because it's not in our gift currently as part of the policy, where you've got damp and mould to rehouse you to a bigger property, it's been a challenge for those particular cases where the families or households are not giving us access or temporarily moving out. So in those cases, we worked with children's services to get them to talk to those families, to encourage them to temporarily move out so we can go in and carry out the repair. So I think in those instances, we've done cross-cutting work, but I appreciate there's probably a lot more we need to be doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe there's a future agenda item here around the lettings policy as well then, because that seems quite crucial in that respect. But the thing I kind of wanted to ask was about the HHRS training, and I was quite surprised to see that at the start of the journey, only one member of the workforce was qualified to carry them out. So you say that like 3 cohorts of staff have now been given the training. So how many staff is in each cohort? So how many staff have been trained overall? And I guess it's just a question of how were we in a space in the borough where, despite the fact that we receive hundreds of complaints about mould a year, we had one person who was able to identify the level of hazard it was and then issue, you know, whatever notice it needs to be subsequently. Like, I just find that like incredibly hard to understand why that had happened.
So in the private sector housing team, that's slightly different, because in order to do our job role, we have to be qualified and as environmental health officers, and we do have a massive recruitment issue. So I've got 6 officers at the moment who are trained and qualified to do HHSRS assessments and then take the appropriate enforcement action. So that's that's 6 officers for the whole of the private rented sector. And obviously, you know, they have other job roles as well. So there is a recruitment shortage. HHSRS is part of what those officers are qualified to do. We've equally looked at trying to get building surveyors in. So rather than have qualified EHOs, to see if we can upskill building surveyors, get them trained on HHSRS and then train them on the enforcement side of things, or even just pass the enforcement side of things over to the enforcement officers. But again, we've struggled getting recruitment, anybody interested in wanting to join the team. So I think there might be a pay issue, but you know.
We had an interesting discussion about that in the private sector renters review
Yeah.
that we're doing, and looking at other models where they have offered like training alongside the job, so they've given like effectively apprenticeships.
Yeah, we've just recruited 2 apprentices. They'll be starting at Middlesex in September and they're joining us in July. So we are looking to grow our own essentially now.
Yes. But yeah, I guess then it comes back to the social housing team, really, which is...
So I think traditionally that there hasn't been a requirement for our building surveyors to be specifically HHSRS trained. And we recognised, you know, that there was a skills gap, which is why we're putting training in place. I think part of the challenge, you know, we've had, and actually the sector has had, is you've got, you know, various landlords trying to find, you know, surveyors who are HHSRS trained to go in and start doing the assessment, because all of a sudden there was a shift, you know, across social housing to have these specific trained staff to go in and do these assessments. So at the time, there was a gap. We have rolled out training and that has increased. I think part of the naivety probably on our part was we can also probably get our housing officers trained on this. Part of the feedback from the training is that where you don't necessarily have a construction background, they have found the training challenging in comparison to, say, surveyors who do have a construction background who can pass. So yeah, traditionally it's not been, you know, an essential part of the job for our surveyors to have that specific training. But I think going forward, that does change, you know, the need based on what we need in Haringey at the moment.
Thanks. I have a couple of questions now. I'll run through a few things relating to the social housing and then a few on private at the end. So my first question was, in terms of how we initially captured the data about what might be category 1, it lists kind of all these different data sources that we used, but then in the end, only 10 of those were actually category 1 and an additional 6 hadn't been captured. So I was just wondering how we captured those 6, like where that came from, and kind of have we adjusted how we collect data as a result of that?
So I think when we responded, and you know, we didn't really, unless it was reported to us, we had to use whatever intelligence we had internally to try and determine where we think the Cat 1 will be. So that's why we developed that predictive analysis of 64. And until you actually physically go in, you can't confirm. So the additional 6 came from outside of those predictive modelling. So you've got the 10 that came within, confirmed within the predictive modelling, and the additional 6 came outside of that.
And how was that? Outside how?
So tenants reporting it to us directly, members reporting it to us, and then we're going out and visiting those properties to confirm it.
Yeah, I mean, some of this happened before Jahed arrived as well, and it's as Jahed said, if you remember, there was a lot of press coverage at the time, so we did start to get tenants, understandably, reporting concerns around damp and mould to a much greater degree than we'd had in the past. But the predictive approach was kind of looking at everything from repairs data to kind of properties where we felt there was a risk of excessive cold. We took a sort of view of doing it that way and being proactive about going out and finding. We do know other landlords just waited for the complaints to come, but we didn't take that approach. We decided to try and look at where there was most likely to be the factors that would suggest there was a risk of significant damp and mould, and we went from there.
Thank you. another 2 points. So we touched on this earlier. How are we doing in terms of demand for decants when people do need to be decanted? And how is that interacting with non-damp and mold related decant demand, for example, building disrepair, something like that? And then my second point was basically, obviously, a part of this process is raising repair orders and getting them done within X number of days, depending on how severe it is. So broad question, is that working as it needs to at the moment? How is it functioning? Because obviously we know about issues in the repairs service. I guess it's a question of whether it's working better within damp and mold than in other areas because of the priority that's been given at the moment. Thanks.
So I think in terms of demand for decant, we now have a pool of temporary decants that we can make available where we find a family living in a Cat 1 property. And that's evolved and improved over time. So initially when we started, we were searching for properties where we can offer a temporary decant or putting families up in hotels. That's no longer the case. We have a pool. I think sometimes the difficulty is the families refusing some of those temporary decants because of the location of the property, or ordinarily we try and offer a like-for-like property. So if they're living in a 3-bedroom, we'll try and offer a temporary decant, which is a 3-bedroom. The legal advice is it doesn't have to be like-for-like, but we try and accommodate the family's request. So we've got a pool of temporary decants, just to answer your question. On the second point around the pressure it's placed on the repair service, it has placed additional pressures on the repair service. And what we try and do is when we go out, especially on those category 1 cases, we try and schedule out the works needed. What we can't always guarantee or confirm is how long it will take to turn around those properties. But we do try and provide clarity as soon as possible. So at the point when we offer a temporary decant, we're not always in a position to tell the families it may take 2 weeks or 3 weeks, because often the contractors need to go out and assess and reassess. But we do have a dedicated team who are there to try and keep residents informed where they have been rehoused. And we are looking to strengthen our internal DLO service as well as bringing in additional contractors. So at the moment we've got one, big contractor that we're using for damp and mold work, but we are looking to expand our supply chain to be able to generate more flexibility within the service to try and turn those properties around a lot quicker.
Thanks. And I realise this might be part of your update, which is next on the agenda item, but at some point, do you think we could get some data on how those repairs within damp and mould, but also more widely, are functioning and kind of how long it's all taking? That would be really useful. Just on the private rented aspect, I suppose just sort of drilling down into what powers we actually have, because I feel like often in the private rented sector, house might be sort of just about legally compliant, but it's really the bare minimum of everything. And in those circumstances, presumably damp and mold can still occur. So what is happening if the landlord is technically legally compliant, but the tenant is reporting damp and mold and it's not being addressed? And then I guess related to that, is there anything we can do? Obviously, we can't change the kind of national legal framework, but is there anything we can do in terms of incentives to make private landlords strive for not just the very bare minimum in terms of insulation and energy classification?
Yeah, so I think, as this was touched on at the very beginning, it's the cause of the damp and mould that I think is the main factor, and getting landlords to address, or identifying and getting landlords to address the actual cause, will allow a better quality of remedy overall. And I think in the past, that is potentially where we've been a bit lax in terms of accepting, certain levels of remedial work rather than an actual, proper remedy. So if it's, a leaking roof, for example, the legislation would be that if that was temporarily fixed, then we would have to accept it. So it's going that extra bit, and maybe facing that challenge in court so that we can, in front of the first tier tribunal, say, well, we asked for those measures because we feel that that's what overridingly is going to fix this long term for the tenant. I think landlords are, in their defence, getting slightly better because it's not cost effective for them to keep on doing smaller jobs. And where we're now in a situation where we've got quite a steady workforce, we can see where the repeat offenders are now, whereas previously it was harder to track that because we had a lot of agency staff and, one person would go and then another person would go, and there wasn't necessarily that consistency in terms of case history. And the licensing scheme helps with that as well, because as part of that process, we look at all of the enforcement case history for a property. So whether it's got planning permission, whether they've had previous offences in the private sector housing team or antisocial behaviour or in waste. So it kind of builds up a picture overall of the type of landlord that we're now kind of dealing with. So the powers are quite limiting, and there's also lots of loopholes. So one of the main things that we're seeing at the moment is that landlords will just appeal the approvement notice and then wait for their day in court, which we know now could be 12 months, 14 months time. And during that period, a tenant has to stay in exactly the same situation as they were in when they reported it. So yeah, that's one of the things that we are facing with rogue landlords wanting to just play the system. We have now got the use of civil penalty notices. So that's a financial penalty that we can issue on landlords. They do seem to be working because they get hit hardest, and those cases are heard a lot quicker than prosecution cases because they're taken to a lower tier within our judicial system. But I think we've got now 6 qualified officers, and so we are serving a lot more improvement notices now, and we are able to see those improvement notices through to enforcement should that be required, and they're fully qualified officers, so they've got the experience, whereas in the past we have struggled with that. So we have seen a shift, Councillor Hymas will be pleased to know, in the number of enforcement notices going out and then the follow-up sort of prosecution or civil penalty notices that landlords are now facing. And as part of the HMO licensing scheme, we do a compliance check, which covers those sort of regulatory things that we expect landlords to comply with, but also the standard of the accommodation as well. And we can pick up things like that through the licensing conditions. So we've got, just under 5,000 HMO licenses now on the register, and we're slowly working through all of them to do compliance checks on them all. And we will then obviously be able to pick up any disrepair elements as part of that. And then the same with the selective scheme. So yeah, we're sort of moving through those compliance checks to achieve that. And the second question, I think there's probably not. We've asked for energy performance certificates as part of the application process for selective. We're going hopefully out to consult on a renewed or a new additional HMO licensing scheme where we'll be asking for the same thing for houses of multiple occupation. And then we're taking action against landlords who have got non-compliant EPCs and trying to encourage landlords who have got lower level EPCs to make use of the government grant funding to improve the energy efficiency of their properties where tenants are on some form of means tested benefit. They can qualify, and it's a contributory grant, so they don't get full grant, but they get money towards improving the energy efficiency of their properties. We also offer discounts in the licensing scheme against the fee. So they get a discount if they've got an A to C energy performance certificate, and they also get a discount if they are an accredited landlord, which means they've been on the training course and they've got no excuse, no defence to not know what their obligations are in terms of meeting their tenants' needs. So I think that's
nice. Interesting. Thank you. Any of the panel want to come back?
Yeah, I'd just say that, like, in maybe also in response to your question, it's like, it seems like there's a lot of work that needs to be done to actually get the existing hazards, never mind the ones which are like on the borderline, like, and it's good to hear, I guess, that has been progressed, because obviously we know that before that, during the pandemic, the figures were pretty appalling in Haringey in terms of enforcement. So I'm glad to hear that is ramping up now. But yeah, I mean, I think tenants can also take action into their own hands, right? There's a lot of things that you can do which don't require legal enforcement. Putting pressure on landlords in informal ways, in my experience, has been quite helpful.
Any other questions on aspects of this agenda item? No? Okay, we'll move on. Thank you very much. So the next item is a verbal update from Jahed. So if you want to start that, thank you.
The verbal update was probably more around trying to understand and agree a forward plan for this committee in terms of what you may want to review for housing services and building safety. So I think, lettings, for example, wouldn't come under my remit, or private sector housing. Just to understand what are the key areas that you'd like to look at within the next 12 months and try and agree a forward plan of some type.
Yeah, well, I did just want to sort of flag that one of the things I requested for this meeting was an update on the status of our voids and sort of where they are, how many there are, and what we're doing to get them turned around and relet more quickly. And I think I also mentioned an update on the housing improvement plan, and those things are both, yeah, I did want full reports on those to this meeting, and it would be good to sort of understand when they can come and why not now.
So I think we can bring, voice and an update on the housing improvement plan to this committee. I think it's just worth noting Cabinet approved the housing improvement plan in April, where we recognised a number of challenges across different teams and services. And I think it's right that where we've got an action plan and we've got an investment programme and a recruitment drive, once that's complete, we can then start seeing the tangible difference it's making. At the moment, it seems slightly premature to talk about the progress on the improvement plan without enabling the actions being delivered on the ground. So I suppose it's more around the timing of when you'd like an update, so we can show from the point when the plan was agreed, the investment we made and the impact it's made on performance.
Councillor Barnes?
I was just going to say, I personally don't think we could really give you an idea of future agenda items, because that's actually the next point on our agenda to discuss those, and this is our first meeting as this group. So I'm not sure we can answer that now, but we can certainly probably do so after this meeting.
Yeah, I think how I envisage this working is that we've obviously got the stuff carried over from previous iterations of this panel. We need to decide as a current panel what we're going to prioritise and when. And I think we'll probably make a general list in our next agenda item, start putting that into some sort of order, and then come back to you on that. Councillor Williams?
Just to add to what Jahed said about the Housing Improvement Plan, the Housing Improvement Board is monitoring that. So when I can get you some more clarity on how we're going to report that, that might help as well. It wouldn't, we wouldn't want the same meeting to happen twice. It would be yeah. So I'll ask that. Well, I have asked that question tonight, so we'll get back to you.
Thank you. Is there anything that either Councillor Williams or any of our officers can say verbally about where we are at with voids at the moment? I mean, that's obviously an aspect of the housing improvement plan.
So in terms of strategy, some of the actions within the improvement plan for voids is recruiting and adding additional capacity on the admin team that manage the void programme, but additionally recruiting additional operatives to bring capacity to our DLO service, who can go in and do the work. And the third step was also procuring additional supply chain. So not only will we be increasing our resources internally within the DLO to do the work, we'll bring in external specialists to also help clear the backlog. And then there's stuff around system changes and reporting that we're making.
There is about to be an action regarding some of the voids in the HCBS as well, and so it's a big contract going out to get think it's 20 properties up to our standard through one contract to get it done, to get those all brought up to standard quickly so that they can then be relet. And so we're hoping they'll be online by October, I think. So there's a lot of things going on, but I think a fuller report might be helpful at some point here.
Councillor Harrison-Mullane.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks to the chair for bringing this item. I think it's really important. It's something that comes up in casework of people noticing voids. We're obviously very aware of the 12,000 people on the waiting list. I mean, just anecdotally, I live in a Haringey block of only 12 flats and 2 of them are currently void and have been for months now. So yeah, this is something that people raise with us as a big problem and that we definitely see in casework.
Okay, thank you. I think we can move on to our discussion as a panel of the work programme. So I think at this point it's fine for Councillor Williams and the officers to leave. Thanks for being with us and answering our questions. So Philip, if you want to introduce this.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So what you have in your pack is a work plan, a 2-year work plan for the previous year and this year. And I guess the point of this discussion is to get a sense from members of the panel of what areas they might like to look at for future panel meetings. I don't know. I don't know if you wanted to maybe go around the panel members and for them to put forward some ideas, and if we could sort of get a long list, and we could start to maybe whittle that down a bit and think about how best to programme those in the four meetings we have in the rest of the year. There's probably also a discussion after that around the scrutiny review that we're currently undertaking around the renting in the private sector, but maybe we'll come back to that.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. That sounds like a good idea. I just wanted to note that on the very last page, page 86, under possible future items, there's a few suggestions there that I've come up with based on initial discussions with the cabinet members and officers. But obviously, if you've got new things to add, please do. Or if you have any opinions on any of those, please let me know. And I also just wanted to say, obviously, I'm aware that there's an ongoing review into private rented sector. And I'm very keen to finish that so that the work doesn't go to waste. And so I think it would also be good to tease out in this discussion how people want to take that forward. I think my instinct is it would be really good to try and get that wrapped up quite promptly, but it's a question of how many more meetings, how much more evidence we feel we need to take, and what a timescale for that would be. Councillor Hymas.
Yeah, we had a lot of meetings. I think there was, there was a sense. So, I mean, I know that there was an outstanding one with, I think, possibly Newham Council, if I'm right. There was a conversation around that, and I know that that was something that Councillor White had been pursuing. There was also the possibility of meeting with the London Renters Union as well, just to hear a bit more of that local perspective, because we did have ACON, which was an interesting meeting, but I think also the London Renters Union would be helpful in that respect too. I guess it would be helpful maybe just to understand from Philip, like, what is your process for writing up? Because obviously you've been making notes and listening to our recommendations, and obviously we also need to meet with the officers, with Lynn and with Sarah, to discuss some of those points that maybe, because actually Lynn said stuff today like they're hiring 2 apprentices, which was actually going to be, I think, part of the recommendation. So just to kind of confirm, some of the things that we talked about, and it would be important, I think, then to have like a kind of debate amongst us in terms of what we want the kind of priority recommendations to be, because I think there could be lots of different things that we all want. From like a private sector renters charter that seemed to be something that they'd done in Tower Hamlets, but then there were also smaller things like, different officers working together better. So yeah, I guess it's just there's probably quite a few steps.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. Yeah, I think yes, there was another local authority that members wanted to speak to, and I've tried to engage with them. I think the cabinet member portfolio changed, so the person who we had contact details for initially and the previous chair was in contact with was no longer responsible for this area. So I have emailed the cabinet member who's now responsible. I haven't had a response. I will chase that up. Realistically, I think we might be sort of getting to the end of sort of the process of trying to ask them to come and speak to us. I mean, it's entirely up to members of the panel who else they would like to speak to. I guess my advice would be we probably want to try and wrap this up as quickly as possible. We have had a number of evidence sessions, and it's whether you want to focus more energy on this or whether you want to sort of try and wrap this up and do another piece of work in a slightly different area. In terms of the recommendation setting, I guess I envisaged as a minimum we would need to have another evidence session with officers and the cabinet member. You could probably join those into sort of, on the same evening, have a sort of a fairly long session with both. And then after that, I would arrange a recommendation setting meeting, probably 2, with members of the panel where we'll sit down, go through some of the evidence, and we can get a sort of a list of what recommendations you'd like to put forward. Once I have a list of recommendations, it's then a sort of, you work backwards and start writing the report and putting the recommendations in there. I would just emphasise and make a plea that it's important that you can demonstrate that you have the evidence to back up your recommendations, so that your recommendations reflect the evidence we've heard, rather than, yeah, what you may or may not have personally think. Anyway, so. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sort of like an overview of the evidence, sort of like bullet points for each of the. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I guess I don't want to go in and be like really
Focused. Yeah, absolutely. No problem. I'll take that away as an action.
I wonder, I know I don't want to burden people with too many meetings, but I wonder whether it might be worth a very short separate meeting on Teams or something, just to agree a way forward with finishing this off. Does that sound okay? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a very quick point. It would just say we should not spend too long on this. I think we need to wrap this up so that we embark on a new review that we can actually complete within this municipal year, because I don't want to have another situation where it's rolling over into the next scrutiny committee. So for me, my preference would be that we wrap this up as soon as possible and then we start a new one.
Yep, noted. And I share that view, I think. Yep.
This is on a slightly different thing, not to do with the review, but I was just looking through the list of possible future items and looking back at what we looked at last year, and one that really jumped out to me that we looked at last year that, given the kinds of reports we had, I think it would make sense for us to revisit and ask for further updates, was aids and adaptations and housing for people with disabilities and other specific needs. When we had that session, we heard about a lot of problems and a lot of plans that hadn't happened yet. So I think an update session would be very helpful.
Thanks, that's a good idea. Philip's noted that. And yeah, Councillor Barnes.
Thank you. I think there's something overall that comes out to me regularly about reporting, which is terribly dull, I know. But, talking about what you've just brought up, I'm thinking about the housing associations. I'm thinking about how the Housing Improvement Board might feed back. It's about how we report that and have it coming in regularly. It might be quarterly, it might be once every 6 months, it might be once a year, so that we can review that. Because If the Housing Improvement Board is overseeing everything, then that's fine. What I'd like them to do is perhaps raise red flags, or we have a risk register that comes regularly. We can talk about what that report might look like, but try to frame that. And we can take advice from the officers perhaps, but we may also have our own ideas based on experience. Similarly, with the housing associations, you know, their accountability seems to be quite poor. This meeting keeps being referenced, but I've never really heard anything back about it. And I get a lot of casework around housing associations who seem to do exactly as they like. And Lynn referenced that she will step in if they're not doing a job, and talked about advocacy, which apparently seems to happen. And then you've mentioned that, and the voids. It's almost like a lot of this stuff could be regularly updated, and that goes through from this current makeup of this scrutiny panel to the next and to the next of their standing items. And so we can look and say, oh, right, you know, you said that we'd be 1,000 homes more decent or whatever, so it's down to 28%, and you said they'll all be decent in 5 years' time. So is that just a comment here, or can we actually see that percentage reduced, and those kinds of things? So it's boring, but I think there's something about reporting that we don't quite get right.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Dawn. Sorry to jump in. I just, I guess also to share experience from other places. I know that in Kensington and Chelsea, the Housing Scrutiny Panel gets regular numbers of how many households are in TA, for example, how many households have been waiting for how long in TA. I think it would be really helpful for us to have regular repairs updates that included how many people have been waiting a week for a repair, how many people have been waiting a month. Yes, I mean, it sounds like.
Philip, is there a precedent for that sort of thing? What do we need to do to make that happen?
I mean, absolutely, you can have regular updates. I guess there's probably a balance. That I think in the past, it's been felt that having, you know, the same items come to the same meeting in the year can be slightly repetitive and perhaps not exact the level of scrutiny that you might want. So in terms of having a slightly more dynamic work programme and doing things, you don't necessarily have to have a report at the meeting in order to sort of keep on top of it. So there's perhaps a way of having informal reports presented to you, and some of the smaller pieces of scrutiny work around a particular topic. So I guess just considering that as a whole package. But
so I was thinking perhaps a dashboard that maybe reports either annually or twice a year, and we would only really go into detail if there was something that was horribly wrong. Otherwise, it's just, this is for your information, these voids have been filled, these houses have been repaired, this is the waiting list, and we go, that's great, or actually that's absolutely shockingly bad, now we want to talk about it. So it's kind of just to keep that, and it frames the discussions that we have, because quite often it can be on a personal interest, and some of those personal interests are mine as well, but there needs to be figures to help us to decide what needs to be focused on, rather than, oh, well, we think this is bad, or we think this would be interesting.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point. So it's obviously there is a new performance framework in place, and it's been agreed that that will report every 6 months to Overview and Scrutiny Committee. And so what we need to do for the panel going forward is to set up an informal session with, how we've done it in other panels is it's a sort of a chair's briefing session informally with the relevant officers, and the other panel members are invited to attend. So we're going to try and set up those finance performance sessions on a quarterly basis. And yeah, I can certainly put those in the diary and we can do that.
Khaled?
Yeah, just wanted to put forward a proposal as a potential review, something. Overcrowding in the borough. We really need to look at this, try and tackle this, make recommendations. David told us today that it's only voluntary, that somebody who's living in a house which is under-occupied often they don't move because it's a family home. It has a lot of sentimental value. This is the home in which their children grew up, but it's also owned by the council. And there are families of 4, 5, 6 people that are living in a one-bed flat. They could easily do with moving into the bigger house. So there are difficult issues to tackle, but I just think that over the years that I've been either a chair or a member of this panel, this is not something that we've really looked at, with any kind of depth, and it is one of the two big problems that recur, in any surgery casework. Is overcrowding and is disrepair. I suspect with disrepair, there's quite a bit being done. Even the damp and mold stuff is part of disrepair, but overcrowding is something that we really need to focus on.
Councillor Hymas.
I'm going to disagree with it. I haven't seen any evidence that overcrowding is comparatively bad in Haringey compared with other boroughs, and I wonder to what extent, if we did an overcrowding review, our recommendations will very much be focused at national government rather than locally, because I wonder whether just my experience of working in Wandsworth and Tower Hamlets is that it was exactly the same, and it's because of forces that are beyond the council's control. But you're saying compelling people to leave bigger houses. I don't know. It's quite a difficult recommendation to make. Obviously, we can offer more.
It's not a recommendation, but I'm saying it's how we think around it, and it may not be a recommendation. The majority of the committee may not agree with some proposal. They might think it's quite draconian. It might impeach on people's individual liberties or whatnot. But I'm saying it's something we need to discuss.
Yeah, can I just come in quickly and then I'll go to Dawn and Holly. So one thing I have discussed as a possibility with cabinet members is doing a scrutiny review of our allocations policy, because that needs to be up for renewal. It's somewhere where we could meaningfully influence. At the moment, there's a question over, obviously, we just don't have enough homes, but there is a question over whether within what we have got, is that being used most effectively? Is it going to the people who need it most? And it's possible that looking at overcrowding and people living in underoccupied homes could be an aspect of that. So that might be one way forward. Councillor, who was first? Holly, or was it Dawn?
It doesn't matter, because I was going to say allocations policy.
Great. Holly.
Yeah, I think allocations policy sounds like it would be a fruitful area. I guess one thing to add on the discussion about overcrowding is the reason that the scheme is voluntary is because where people have secure tenancies, the council legally can't require them to move. So yeah, I share Tammy's concerns that our recommendations are going to end up not focusing on things that the council legally has in its power to do, because most of the time the reason for under occupation is people having security of tenure, and I don't think any of us would want to take away security of tenure, a very important part of the social housing system. So yeah, there's that. And then I guess also it sounds like maybe it wouldn't need to be a lengthy review, but we have some space where maybe we'd want to make some recommendations about voids, and I feel like that kind of complements looking at the allocations policy as well. So maybe there's room for a shorter piece of work on that.
Yeah, or indeed having them both be part of the same thing, but we can discuss further the best way of doing that. Councillor Hymas, and then also just a prompt if anyone wanted to add anything new to suggestions for future work.
Yeah, I mean, on that, I think it's actually something you said, Alex, but I kind of feel like we should be making recommendations at the end of every meeting. So I think that we could actually just do one scrutiny panel meeting on voids, and at the end of that, I would suggest making it and then investing that power in the chair to then go and speak to the cabinet member on that with one of us or whoever. I think we could be more effective within the panel meetings that we have in terms of pursuing material things that come up to today, for example, there are several actions that have come up, which I think historically on this panel in the last year didn't end up getting pursued, which meant that we kind of effectively were starting from scratch, which comes back to the dashboard point, but also comes back to the point of like, yeah, making these concrete recommendations, which we then can track through the work plan.
Yeah, could I ask Philip, because I think I did mention this to you when we discussed this, is that within our remit? Could we actually make tangible recommendations at the end of a meeting like this, or would it have to be more a sort of action, somebody's going to do X?
I think I'd have to come back and confirm with you. I think all of the powers sit within the main committee. So I guess if you're making formal recommendations to the cabinet, they would have to be ratified by the main committee. So yeah, I guess that's where the difference between sort of actions emanating from this meeting come from and sort of formal recommendations. But there is no reason that you can't do short focused pieces of scrutiny work like a task and finish group. So rather than doing a review where you have 10 evidence sessions, you could have 2 or 3 where you maybe take 2 evidence sessions and you turn the report around fairly quickly. Yeah, I guess that's probably part of this wider discussion.
Thanks. John, did you have your hand up? No.
I just wanted
to
come back.
Turn your mic on. Sorry.
You can hear me. I speak very loudly. Just the allocations policy, definitely. Just want to come back on what you've said, Holly, about the security of tenure. That's not being taken away. So if a person is moved from one type of property, a bigger property to a smaller property, they still have security of tenure. That is not being taken away. It's just they're being placed in accommodation that is more suitable for the occupancy. Because, and we have to discuss this, I'm not expecting us to come up with the answers here. I can't justify, as a councillor, where it's coming out of public finances, that two people will occupy a 4-bedroom house, whereas 5 people will be living in a 1-bed flat. We finance this. This is from our funds. This is from our budget. So I think there is also the budgetary and the finance aspects of it that we've got to look at. The security of tenure is not affected. They continue to have security of tenure.
Yeah, it's a discussion for another time. If you want to quickly come back, Holly, then we'll wrap this up.
Just to very quickly come back, I mean, it's to do with the tenancy agreements that people have. If people have security of tenure, then they have a lifetime tenancy agreement for the specific property that they're allocated at the time. So that's why they can't legally be moved.
Yep, Tammy.
I'm just wondering, in terms of future items, I think there's just a piece about climate change that should be included. That is both in terms of the council's insulation drive, as well as on kind of existing construction projects, future construction projects, and obviously demolition in particular, because we know how environmentally like devastating retrofitting is. I just think, like, obviously we might touch upon that a little bit in the local plan, but I think if we could have a session where maybe we hear from like Joe Baker as well, that would be really good.
Yeah, it's a good idea. I think it would make sense to tie that into the timing of the draft local plan so that we can see what is being proposed, but I think we could definitely have an additional focus on climate measures. John, did you want to come in?
Yeah, well, there is a policy called the holistic approach that when you do works on an estate or a block or a house, you do everything that needs to be done in one go, because it's cost effective and it causes much less inconvenience to the residents, because we haven't had a cyclical decoration policy for 20 years at least. So none of our blocks, our estates, have had all their communal areas decorated for over 20 years. Because we picked and chosen odd things that we want to do when there's a bit of money, and it all becomes disjointed. So I think the holistic policy, which was agreed by Homes for Haringey and by the council, I think it's under threat. because what he said about the money, obviously, if you do everything in one estate, that's taking a bit more money, so it probably delays you getting round to the rest. But I think they want to remove themselves from the holistic policy, which I think is a backward step, because we're just going to go on doing odd bits all over the place, and our estates are never going to look really good and all together, you know. So it's just an observation.
Yeah, no, that's I wasn't particularly aware of that, so we can have a discussion about maybe raising that in relation to a future meeting. Some of the other stuff we're going to look at. I'm going to wrap this up now. If anybody wants to suggest anything else that hasn't occurred to them right here and now, then just email over. This is a kind of, you know, we can develop this list and fit in the timings as they work best. So next item is items of urgent business. There aren't any. Final item, future meeting dates. Those are all in your packs, just to note. And with that, I'll bring the meeting to a close. Thanks, everybody.